Welcome, everyone. You're all very welcome here today in this virtual space with us. We're very glad that you're taking some time to be with us. My name is Hans Gustafsson, and I have the honor to serve as the director of the J. Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies at the University of St. Thomas here in Minnesota. We're delighted to have you join us over the next hour in what is certain to be an engaging experience with Dr. Katharine Gerbner and Dominique Stewart. Now, before we begin, and in light of recent events here in Minnesota, I'd like to take a moment to just reiterate what our university president, President Sullivan, publicly posted yesterday about that our campus community here at St. Thomas has been devastated by the death of Daunte Wright, who was shot and killed yesterday by law enforcement in Brooklyn Park here in Minnesota. And we stand with all those impacted by this latest news, especially as it comes amidst an already challenging time during the Chauvin trial. And with President Sullivan, we invite everyone to join in praying for and holding in their thoughts the Wright family and their immediate community. And during this time of the pandemic, we know you have a growing list of webinar options these days at all hours of the days, and time is precious. So we certainly appreciate you choosing to be with us today over the noon hour. And today at 12:10, which is only a couple minutes from now, for those of you who are part of the St. Thomas community, our Office for Mission and the Racial Justice Initiative at St. Thomas is hosting a healing and prayer service. There will also be a prayer for peace and justice this afternoon at 4 p.m. in the Iverson Center for Faith, which you could consider attending as well. But if you plan to log off today and attend the 12:10 p.m. event, and you still want to view this webinar, you can contact the J. Phillips Center. You can email us later for a video link, and we will make that available to you. And I will drop that I will drop that email into the chat link presently for you to follow up. It's also available on the J. Phillips Center website. Now, today's event is organized and sponsored by the J. Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies here at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. A couple of quick housekeeping items. After an opening interview of Dr. Gerbner by Dominic, we plan to have a time for some questions, and we aim to be done by 12:45 p.m. Central. So even though the chat function has been disabled, you're welcomed and encouraged to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions at any point. We'll hold on to these questions for our guests to address towards the end of the interview. Before I introduce Dominique Stewart, I'm happy to point out that the book upon which much of today's conversation is based is by Dr. Gerbner is called Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, published by Dr. Gerbner with University of Pennsylvania Press. And you can purchase a copy locally in St. Paul at Next Chapter Books or online at the University of Pennsylvania Press. And I will drop those links into the chat here shortly as well. Once it's underway, I'll drop those links. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dominique Stewart, who will then introduce our special guest and conduct the interview and then moderate the Q&A portion of the program during the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar. Now, Dominic is completing his final year of undergraduate studies here at the University of St. Thomas with majors in actuarial science and French and a minor in interreligious studies and comparative theology. Dominic has received 2 interreligious research fellowships over the past 2 years. He's done a number of other things at St. Thomas, too much to list here today. For his current fellowship, he's investigating Caribbean identity through interreligious encounters in West Indian Francophone literature. And last year, he examined early encounters between Hindu communities in Jamaica with the early Rastafari movement and the resulting religious exchange between them. His research from that particular project resulted in not only an academic presentation at the regional gathering of the American Academy of Religion in 2020, but also just last month, he published his findings in the peer-reviewed academic journal, the Journal for Interreligious Studies, which is open access if you want to go find his article. The name of his article is Early Encounters in Colonial Jamaica, Hindu and Rastafari Divine Metaphysics. Now, it's my great honor to welcome you to join me in virtually welcoming Dominique Stewart. Dominic, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gustafson, for that introduction. Thank you so much. That was a really nice introduction. So this conversation on modern racial categories is timely with the recent killing of Daunte Wright 2 days ago, just as Dr. Gustafson has said, by the police. We also are existing in the climate of the ongoing trials of the Chauvin trials here in Minnesota. I'm going to start off this conversation by reading the summary of Dr. Gerbner's book, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, to help orient our audience. Could slaves become Christian? If so, did their conversion lead to freedom? If not, then how could perpetual enslavement be justified? In Christian Slavery, Katharine Gerbner contends that religion was fundamental to the development of both slavery and race in the Protestant Atlantic world. Slave owners in the Caribbean and elsewhere established governments and legal codes based on an ideology of Protestant supremacy, which excluded the majority of enslaved men and women from Christian communities. For slaveholders, Christianity was a sign of freedom, and most believed that slaves would not be eligible for conversion. When Protestant missionaries arrived in the plantation colonies intending to convert enslaved Africans to Christianity in the 1670s, they were appalled that most slave owners rejected the prospect of slave conversion. Slaveholders regularly attacked missionaries, both verbally and physically, and blamed the evangelizing newcomers for slave rebellions. In response, Quakers, Anglican, and Moravian missionaries articulated a vision of Christian slavery, arguing that Christianity would make slaves hardworking and loyal. Over time, missionaries increasingly used the language of race to support their arguments for slave conversion. Enslaved Christians, meanwhile, developed an alternate vision of Protestantism that linked religious conversion to literacy and freedom. Christian slavery shows how the contentions between slave owners, enslaved people, and missionaries transformed the practice of Protestantism and the language of race in the early modern Atlantic world. Dr. Katharine Gerbner, Associate Professor of History and McKnight Land Grant Professor at the University of Minnesota. It is a pleasure to have you here, and I'm excited to have you talk about your work. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Thank you for having me. And I also want to thank Hans and the J. Phillips Center for inviting me today. And Dominic, to you for moderating this conversation. And I think before we begin, I also just want to acknowledge that this conversation is happening in a really difficult week with the tragic murder of Daunte Wright 2 days ago here in the Twin Cities. And of course, the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and racial injustice. So I want to start by just sort of holding space for that, the pain that so many people are feeling. And I hope that the conversation today can shed some light on the historical origins of some of the major challenges that are confronting our society today, especially white supremacy. So thank you again for inviting me, and thank you to all of you who are here with us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerbner. As Dr. Gustafson has said earlier, I just want to remind our audience that while the conversation is happening, they can pose questions using the Q&A feature, and we will be fielding them towards the end. So Dr. Gerbner, I wanted to start off by asking about this book and your research in general terms. What drew you to this kind of work exactly? What made you want to write about some of the intersections between Christianity and slavery?
Right. Well, I guess I'll start off by saying that I did not set out to write a book called Christian Slavery. And actually, when I started doing my research, I was motivated mostly by the desire to understand, positive social movements like abolition and anti-slavery. And so what I did, and this was, 15 years ago, I began by researching the first anti-slavery protest in American history, which was written in 1688 by a group of Quakers in Philadelphia. And this, for me, this was also a personal history. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I went to a Quaker school in Germantown, not far from where that protest was written. And I had learned growing up that Quakers were leaders in the abolitionist movement. And so my research was trying to sort of uncover that history and to learn from it in order to sort of fight for racial justice today. But what I realized when I went and did the research, if you look back at the protests, it was actually rejected, even among Quakers, who are thought of as sort of the leaders of the abolitionist movement. And so I said, well, geez, I didn't learn that growing up. Why was this rejected? And how can I understand what was really happening? And so with that realization, my research shifted, and I started to ask different questions and to look in different places. So, my new questions were, well, why did Quakers and other European Christians accept slavery in the 17th century? How did they justify enslaving other people within their theological worldviews? And then also, what did it mean for enslaved and free Africans to convert to Christianity? What did Christian practice mean to them? And I also changed the geography of my questions. I realized that the Caribbean was absolutely crucial to understanding the relationship between Christianity and slavery and race in early America, but it continues to be a really important place that I think more historians are starting to pay attention, but previously, if you look back at histories, it's been ignored. So yeah, these are the questions that then fueled my research. And I moved from studying Quakers in Pennsylvania to studying all forms of, or all sorts of Christians throughout especially the British colonies, and including and centering on places like Barbados that have been traditionally ignored.
Okay, wow. So many questions I have from that just general introduction. Well, let's start off with, I guess, a kind of narrowing of what you said, and to think about Protestantism and Catholicism during this period. So you spoke about the Quakers. So could you provide a kind of summarizing comparison between the treatment of slavery within Catholicism and how it was articulated in Protestantism? In other words, how did Catholics and Protestants, specifically Quakers, as you were dealing with, formulate their theologies of slavery?
Yes, such a huge question and important question. The history of Catholicism and slavery is actually very different from the history of Protestantism and slavery. And this is something I realized increasingly as I did my research. But in order to understand this, we really have to go back in time to the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This is when Spain and Portugal were beginning to colonize parts of the Americas. And as they did so, they began to enslave indigenous people as well as enslaving people in the West African coast. And they looked to the Pope to sort of justify these practices. And so what you see is that the Pope and the Iberian monarchs began to issue legal codes that were intended to regulate the relationship between Catholicism and slavery. And so these legal codes, these people, they began to form a way for Catholic enslavers to sort of incorporate Catholicism into the practice of slavery. So basically what it said is that you need to, baptism was sort of part of the process of enslavement, and it justified enslavement. And I want to emphasize that this isn't, this is absolutely not altruistic, right? So Catholic slave owners are then supposed to baptize all enslaved people and to provide some religious instruction. But what it did was provide a religious justification for enslavement. And the Iberian monarchs also saw sort of Catholic baptism as a way to not only try to sort of control the enslaved population, but it also actually helped them check the power of their colonists. Within sort of the actual practice of Catholicism in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, though, Catholic baptism it did offer enslaved people an avenue to advocate for themselves. So since they were recognized as Catholic, we have evidence that some enslaved people were able to sort of use legal avenues to sort of advocate for themselves, to fight separation of families and things like this. This was not always the case, but it was sort of it was a possibility. And then if you look at the English, Danish, and Dutch colonies, which were founded quite a bit after this, Portuguese and Spanish colonies, right, between 1500 and 1650, we have, of course, the Protestant Reformation happens. And this, it's hard to sum that up in just a sentence or two, but I think it's fair to say that there were a lot of fundamental disagreements about crucial things like what was the proper preparation for baptism and what was the meaning of true conversion. And these debates had a really important repercussion when Protestants were debating, when should an enslaved person be baptized? What happens in baptism? Does baptism equal, freedom in terms of like an earthly sense of freedom or not? But the other really important difference, I would say, is to recognize how much the Protestant Reformation changed the bureaucratic structure of the church. So, you have a lot more decentralization. And so I think actually, if you just look at the Church of England, this is a good example. In the 16th century, right, we know that Henry VIII declared a top-down Reformation, broke with the Pope. And over the next century, we have fights, throughout England and the British Isles about, did this go far enough? Was it too far? But then we have the English Civil War culminating just as, there are English people colonizing the Americas and participating in the slave trade. And so what this meant is that the Church of England was actually disestablished in the mid-17th century, just as English were colonizing parts of the Americas. And this meant that English slave owners had a lot more power to create their own laws about the relationship between Protestantism and slavery. And I mean, we'll talk about this more, but this had a huge effect on the way Protestantism and slavery developed as opposed to Catholicism and slavery.
Interesting. That's really fascinating. And you spoke about it from the European lens, and I'm thinking now about especially what was all of this like, especially from the Black lens. So I'm looking through what you're saying through the Black lens of slavery and religion, right? And so I'm asking, what would Christianity, or what could Christianity have meant to the enslaved or the slaves in these colonies, including those who converted? You touched on that a bit, so could you go into greater detail about that?
Yes, this is such an important question. It's also one of the hardest questions to answer because, right, we know most archival sources are written by European men. And so it's much harder to access the perspectives of enslaved and free Africans who may have converted. But I think that it's absolutely essential to use as many methodological tools as we can in order to try to do so. And so, in my own research, I think, first of all, it's important to say that when we're talking about encounters with Christianity, we need to start by saying that there were Africans who were Christian before they were enslaved, and then they were enslaved and brought to the Americas. So the Kingdom of Congo, for example, adopted Catholicism in the 16th century. And so we know that some enslaved Africans would have already been Christian, or at least been familiar with many of the theological concepts before they reached the Americas. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind. The other thing is that I think it's crucial to think about the many sort of like attractive aspects that Christianity and Christian conversion may have had. And in my own research, I've sort of identified a few of them. One is, this seems simple, but community, right? So Christian congregations, they formed a really important locus of support and kinship. So in my own research, looking at the congregations that formed in places like Barbados or Jamaica, you see family groups, kin groups, like joining together. And And another thing I'll say is that probably the most successful Christian congregations are the ones that are either Black-led or they provide really significant leadership opportunities for Black Christians. And so in this way, sort of a Christian church can provide sort of cover and sort of support for African diasporic communities. The second thing that I noticed in doing my research is that literacy was really, really was a huge draw. So some missionaries taught enslaved people how to read the Bible and write, and this was extremely popular. It also was extremely unpopular among slave owners for reasons that you might guess. But in the early missionary diaries that I've read, they just go on and on about how much demand there was for reading lessons. So this isn't something that missionaries are forcing. This is something that enslaved and free Black people are advocating for. And again, here we should contextualize, right? It's not as if this is the first time that literacy is being introduced, right? If we go back to West African history, especially somewhere, in Northwestern Africa, we know where Islam was the dominant religion. There's actually more literacy training than in Europe, right? So some people are coming with some literacy skills, but then this is absolutely something that's attractive. And then the third thing I'll say is, right, we can't ignore theology either, right? So if you look at the Moravians, and I'll be talking a lot about the Moravian Church because their records are really the best, but they really emphasize the suffering of Jesus in their missions. And I think it's not a huge stretch to say that this could be an evocative and meaningful aspect of Christian theology to people who were being tortured and subjected to such cruel treatment. But I also want to say that that theology was always contested. And the other thing that's really fascinating when you get into the nitty-gritty of the conversations I see happening within 18th century congregations is that, especially as Black Christians read the Bible on their own, they have conflicts with white missionaries about what should we emphasize about Christian theology. The liberatory aspects of Exodus, right? That's a huge area of controversy. And many people here may have seen that sort of the missionary Bible that was discovered, in which white missionaries, this is from a little bit later on, I think it's 19th century, missionaries have literally just edited out, cut out huge parts of scripture in order to make sure that there wasn't anything that was, potentially dangerous in that content, in that theological content that could be used to sort of, for example, support a rebellion or argue against enslavement. And so the theological aspect could be deeply meaningful, but it was always contested.
Yeah. So, wow. Okay, that's interesting. And I read your book, and I told you before, I really like your book. One of the pieces of evidence that you use in your book is a letter from Marota, from the island of St. Thomas. She's one of the converted enslaved that you talk about in your book. And she wrote a letter to the Queen of Denmark asking for the support of Black Christians. And that was fascinating to me. And there was also other letters that focused on the problems, as you said, that Christians faced, Black Christians were facing. So could you talk just a little more about these historical sources and specifically about Marota's letter?
Yes, right. I've mentioned sort of the fact that sources can be difficult, but some of the most exciting ones come from the Moravian archives. And so Marota's letter is one of these. So it's a fascinating source because Marota had she was born in West Africa in Grand Popo. It's now in Benin, and she was enslaved, brought to the Danish West Indies, which is now the U.S. Virgin Islands. And this letter actually, by the time she wrote this letter, she had been freed, but she was addressing this to the Queen of Denmark. And in the letter, it's actually written in two languages. So on the left side, you have Maratha's natal language, Fan, and on the right side, you have Dutch Creole, which was sort of the lingua franca of the Danish West Indies. And the letter itself is a plea to the Queen to intercede on behalf of Black Christians, like Black Christian women like Maratha, who were being beaten and beaten by white people for things like carrying Bibles, attending worship meetings. And it's a really, it's a heart-wrenching appeal written. What I love about it, among other things, is it's written from one woman to another woman. And it also sort of reveals some of the challenges that were facing Black Christians in places like the Danish West Indies. And when it was written in 1739, it was actually accompanied by another letter, also written in Dutch Creole, and it was signed by several other Black Moravians on St. Thomas. And that letter went into more detail about what was happening to the congregation. So, this is a quotation from it. The white planters, quote, beat and injure us when we learn about the Savior. They burn our books, call our baptism the baptism of dogs, and call the brethren are the white Moravian missionaries, and call the brethren beasts. And so, aside from, here you see sort of the fact that literacy, right, books play this really important role, both in the practice of Moravian Christianity on the islands, but also in the response from white enslavers. But I also think that these shed light onto how Africans and their descendants were really arguing for their own right to become Christian. And it also undermines what I think is one of the major myths about Christianity and slavery, which is that enslaved people were forced to become Christian, or that Christian conversion was just a source of slave control. And, I can talk a little bit more about why this came into being. This is maybe what, missionaries and slave owners were hoping for, but it was actually, if you look at these kinds of sources, especially in the early colonial period, that's just not true.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. One of the ideas that you talk about in your book is Protestant supremacy. I've never heard that before. I know about white supremacy. I've heard that before, but what exactly is Protestant supremacy?
Yes. So was sort of this kind of bridges really easily with where I was going in my the last answer. But what we see when we actually look at records is that most Protestant slave owners did not want enslaved people to convert to Christianity, right? They thought of Christianity, and specifically Protestant, as a religion that was for free people. And so they worried that a baptized slave would demand freedom or rebel against slavery. And so this is why you see that they exclude enslaved people from Protestant churches, especially in places with large enslaved populations like Barbados. And so in my book, I decided, right, you've never heard of the term because I made it up. I thought it was really important to give it a name because I didn't feel like it had been fully appreciated. So I called this ideology, sort of this anti-conversion sentiment, Protestant supremacy. And I think that I did that for a couple of reasons. First, I think that it fit the way that I saw religion functioning in early colonial slave societies in the British Atlantic world. So, right, in the 17th century, we have to remember the concept of like whiteness, racial whiteness did not yet exist. So there was no white supremacy yet. Instead, enslavers were using religious difference to govern and police the enslaved and free Black populations, right? So they were thinking, okay, well, I can't enslave other Christians, but I can enslave heathens, right? So this was one of the principal reasons for the justification of slavery in the 17th century. And so, right, in the book, I argue that Protestant supremacy is actually the forerunner, like the origin of white supremacy, but that these ideologies are linked. So, for example, if you look in the earliest slave laws in the English colonies, colonists don't actually call themselves white, right? These are European Christians, but they don't call themselves white. Instead, they call themselves Christians. And over time, you see the language, it's slave-owning legislators who introduced this language of whiteness into law books. In some cases, they literally replaced the word Christian with the word white. And you have to look at when this happens, right? They did so just as a small but significant number of enslaved and free Blacks had gained access to baptism and were themselves becoming Christian and Protestant, specifically Protestant. And these men and women were then claiming new rights as Christians. So the history of conversion is really intimately tied to this history of race. And one of the most important points I try to make is that you can't understand the emergence of whiteness or the history of white supremacy without understanding and looking at the history of religion as well.
Interesting. And I think you answered the next question I actually wanted to ask, because there was a quote in your book that was like, the inclusion of a race-based society for slavery within Zinzendorf's speech marked an important trend. As missionaries and their supporters sought to appease the fears of the white planters, they turned increasingly to the language of race to demonstrate the stability of slavery and its compatibility with conversion. And so that, I think you answered that question. Now, what I want to go into more of is the kinds of interreligious encounters that were happening during this period. Interreligious encounters and productions are very important and for understanding the Caribbean today, in the past, and so on. We have spoken about Christianity without necessarily clarifying the kinds of permutations. Well, you did clarify some of the permutations. I'm lying. You did clarify some of the permutations of Christianity. And you spoke about the Moravian Church, what was happening there. I also see that in your recent publication, you focused on Obeah in Jamaica. But I want to ask specifically, in these contexts that you're doing research in, how did some of the African religious practice of the enslaved encounter, or how did they exactly integrate into Christianity?
Yes, this is such a interesting and intriguing aspect of this research. So you mentioned this article about Obeah in Jamaica, which is, again, surprise, drawn from Moravian archives, but on Jamaica, not Barbados, or not St. Thomas. And what I found here is that I found that enslaved and free Blacks, including Maroons on Jamaica, in the 1750s called this Moravian missionary Obeah when he first arrived. And Obeah is a very really complicated concept to define, but and it's sort of changed over time. But it's an African-derived religious and spiritual institution that has medicinal, political, and religious elements. And it was actually criminalized in 1760 after Obeah practitioners were involved in a massive slave revolt called Tacky's Rebellion. Actually remains a crime in much of the Caribbean today. And so the challenge here is, what's the hidden history of Obeah before it's criminalized? Can we decolonize this history? And so one of my questions is, what does it mean that a Christian missionary is called an Obeah man in the 1750s? What can that tell us about sort of the African diasporic frameworks and epistemologies, and how they are at play in these interreligious or in these encounters? And I don't have a definitive answer yet, but I think that these are the kinds of questions that I've been asking. And another way that I've been doing this in sort of my more recent research is by looking again closer at the writings that we do have of African Christians. And so Marata, going back to her letter, I noted that it's in both Fon and Dutch Creole. So, we can actually see how she translated the term "the Lord Jesus" in Fon, right? And she does so. She says "Vodou Mao," right, like Vodun, which is right, again, a term that has been, right, is sort of the etymology is it's become sort of voodoo, right, criminalized and sort of and sort of subjected to a huge amount of misinformation. But if you go back and look at the etymology, right, like thinking about, well, what was it like? Why was she translating it in this way? What can this 18th century text tell us about Vodun and the way that Africans were drawing on sort of theological and intellectual frameworks to understand Christian theology? And again, I think one of the to even start to answer these questions, we have to recognize that all religious practices have these long histories and they're always constantly evolving, right? So I think one of the problems with talking about an encounter moment is that you assume that these are two static cultures or two static religions, right? These are always being sort of there are shifts, like religious practice shifts, theological shifts, and so thinking about this as one moment and these in a longer stream of religious history is the way that I've been approaching this. And again, it opens a lot of doors and it makes me ask lots of questions. And I have very few definitive answers, but I think maybe that's the way it should be.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree. Wow, I agree. So, and I'm thinking about the laws that you mentioned earlier of Barbados and the ways in which, for example, they were switching out Christian for white. In some cases, they literally just had the same law, but they updated it by changing Christian for white. Now, I'm thinking about how these laws in Barbados, being one of the earliest fully developed British plantation colonies or societies, how did it influence other British colonies and societies?
Yeah. Right. Again, here, Barbados is so crucial because the laws that are created there are literally, if you look at the 1660 sort of slave code, in Jamaica, a couple decades later, they just take it and they like repeat the same thing. They change a few words, and then you see the same legal codes then literally taken from there into South Carolina. And so it's, if you're looking at the geographical influence, right? It's like it's often coming from the Caribbean into North America. But I also want to talk a little bit more about, right, exactly like when and why that happens, because I think seeing, I think that many scholars have recognized that sort of the word white replaced the word Christian in these legal codes. And one of the questions I asked in my research is like exactly when and why, right? And so, one of the key points that I think is really critical to understand is that if you look at the legal archives and sort of the introduction of the language of whiteness, and you put them next to the baptismal records, you can see that it's in the same decade that you have sort of a tipping point number of free Black Christians who are, who have converted and earned their freedom somehow. That it's in that moment that that slave owners are sort of thinking, oh gosh, well, if our whole power structure is based on sort of being Christian and male and 21 and owning property, and these formerly enslaved people are now Christian and male, they might be able to own property. What's going to stop them from gaining more power? And that's where you see the introduction of the language of whiteness to sort of create another buffer of control and oppression, right? So I think that that it's really important to think of this not as some abstract thing that sort of just happened, but rather as a political tactic that was enacted by in like slave owners, English slave owners who were doing something very intentional, which was protecting their own power.
Okay, that really helps to clarify some of the questions that I had. And I'm looking at the time, it's 12:27, so I think it's best to probably start asking questions because I'm seeing a lot of questions coming from the audience. So I think it's probably good to start asking some of them. So the first question that I want to ask is from an anonymous person, and they said, how much did the Iberian laws regarding limpieza de sangre, perhaps among the first European examples of institutionalized racism, impact how slave converts were viewed?
That's a great question. So, right, the Iberian laws regarding limpieza de sangre, so like that's like the purity of blood, and this is absolutely central to the way that racial formations occurred in especially the Spanish Americas. So I talked to I'll answer this specific question, then I want to say a little bit more about this, how slave converts were viewed. I'm assuming this means within sort of like a Catholic context. And it's important to emphasize here that there's still racism, right, within Latin America. It's a different racial categorization that develops that is based on limpieza de sangre. If you compare it to what happens in Barbados, is that you have the first inklings of the one drop rule, right? So when we think about race and we think about whiteness, what does it mean to be white? In different places and at different times, it means different things. So in Barbados, you actually have a law in 1709 that specifically clarifies that a white person could have, quote, no extract from a Black person. And that is sort of, at least the first time I've ever seen the one drop rule applied in sort of governing racial formations and the definitions of whiteness. And with limpieza de sangre, it's a different formulation. I'm not going to go into the details of limpieza de sangre, but I will. I can recommend some great books about this. There's. Now I'm forgetting the name. Okay, I will, if people follow up with me, I will recommend some excellent books specifically on that. But you have a much more sort of complicated matrix of governing, the racial hierarchy spectrum. And that absolutely has an influence on sort of conversion and religion, because racism is still permeating sort of, in this case, sort of Spanish American Catholicism, but it's in a different way than it permeates what you see in Barbados or in North America.
Okay, so one of the members of the audience is asking about the letter to the Queen of Denmark, and they were wondering if you know whether or not the Queen of Denmark received or responded to the letter written by Maratha.
We don't have evidence of that, and it's I kind of think that she probably did see it. The Moravian Church later printed. So I have a manuscript copy of the letter, but there's also it was later printed by the Moravian Church, and so it was in circulation. And I know that Moravian leadership, they were in contact with the Danish court. So, but we have no evidence that it was ever received for sure. And there was no response. But I wish there had been, right? This is my constant issue. Is like, where is that source? I want to read what they thought, but alas, it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's another question. This looks like a question about apologetics or something like that. To what extent did modern endorsements of slavery by Christians rely on and or mirror potential ancient ones, such as Paul's letter to Philemon? What ancient texts were invoked to defend this perspective?
Yeah, so you definitely see ancient texts being invoked. What's I think also particularly interesting is also seeing how there are aspects of scripture that get sort of interpreted in very, we'll say, creative ways, right? And so the curse of Ham is, of course, is the most prominent one that really plays a huge role, especially in justifying race-based slavery. If you go back and look at the interpretation and how they introduce race, it doesn't make so much sense, right? But there are definitely efforts to not only create sort of ancient justifications for slavery, but new interpretations. And then there is, within the Protestant context, you even see Protestant missionaries who are trying to advocate for evangelizing to enslaved people. They're even saying, well, Catholics are doing it, right? So there's also contemporary efforts to justify slavery within a Protestant context that draw on, contemporary, as in 17th century, 18th century examples.
Okay. So the next question is about the founder of the Quakers. So it says, in your book, George, you challenge the idea that the founder of the Quakers, George Fox, was anti-slavery or within the kind of proto-abolitionist sentiment. How do you argue against this narrative?
Right. So I sort of started by talking about the Quaker tradition, and George Fox is the founder of Quakerism. And he's really known for being radical in his beliefs about equality and peace. And so many historians have sort of been confused by the fact that he was not a firm abolitionist. And there have been a lot of debates of whether he was a proto-abolitionist or not. And in my book, and sort of more generally, I argue that this is that's the wrong question to ask. And it's really an anachronistic question because it's looking back in time from even like the 19th century, late 18th century, when the Quakers were abolitionists, and saying, well, where did this start? Actually, it's the way I started, right? And I decided that was the wrong approach. But in order to really understand why that isn't the best approach, I think you have to look at the details. So George Fox, for example, visited Barbados in 1671. And it was his first time ever seeing an American slave society. And, he actually got sick for a month. And then when he got better, he spoke to friends, Quakers called themselves friends, about sort of his new vision for Quakerism. And here I feel like he could have, asserted an anti-slavery stance. Instead, he said something different. He advocated for Quakers to be benevolent slaveholders, and he urged white friends to worship with enslaved and freed Africans. And so I think, that's actually a radical vision for the time. Like we talked about, this is in a Protestant supremacist society, so they got attacked for that position. But it's not abolitionist. And second, when we try to find the seat of abolition in his writings, we miss this other important point, which was he was arguing for benevolent slaveholding, right? And so that's actually connecting him with a whole different history. In my book, I call this Christian slavery, right? This is where the title of the book comes from, this effort to reconcile Christianity and slavery and to make a case for why they are compatible. And so in this way, you can actually argue that Fox is just as, not that he has nothing to do with the history of abolition, but that you could also easily connect him to the long history of pro-slavery thought. And so when we just talk about finding the seat of abolition, we miss all of that complexity of the actual influence that he had at the time.
Thank you. Another question that came in is about the concept of justice, the idea of heaven being present. So they're wondering how both groups would envision the idea of justice during these contexts. Would men and women purposefully participate in slavery, still hoping for heaven, or was it just not a big part of cosmological justice at that time?
Wow. So the concept of justice, well, I think that there was definitely an undercurrent of critique among Black Christians about the failures of their enslavers, and you see them challenging challenging whether they're true Christians, right? And so there, I think you can read in sort of an sort of the fact that there is a belief in that justice will be served in some way. But I also think, this idea of sort of justice coming later is also used by missionaries in a way that I think is problematic, in that they're saying, well, don't worry, and so you see this, I call this, the difference between inner slavery and outer slavery. This is how they framed it, right? So it doesn't matter that you're enslaved, it's you are truly free, you will be truly free in the afterlife, in heaven. And so you see that argument being turned in, I think, a problematic way to justify slavery as well. So I think it's a complicated, it's a complicated issue, and I think that it has many different sides.
Mm-hmm. No, this person is asking about the American context, the United States of America's context, and African Americans specifically. You spoke a lot about the Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica and St. Thomas. So they're asking what are the particular ways in which African Americans were making Christianity their own? You touched on this, and you went on it in detail. Could you reiterate some of the ideas that you spoke about?
Yes, it was the tip of the iceberg, right? There are so many ways in which you can see this happening. From, if you look at sort of the histories of like the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and sort of this movement in the 18th century to literally, right, create churches that were incorporated and had all Black leadership to sort of protect them from racism. There are sort of elements of religious practices, from different practices like forms of reading, forms of dance and song, institutional forms, theological forms. It's almost hard to sort of to limit this answer, because one of the big sort of debates within this field sort of historically has been about what was destroyed in the Middle Passage, and what I think scholars and historians have increasingly come to recognize is that we have to understand more fully West African and African history in order to even start to begin to understand these questions like how did African Americans make Christianity their own? Because it's you brought your history along with you. You brought your culture and your religion and your memories along with you, and that was fundamental to the way that that African American Christianity was formed, and the way that it was was built and practiced. And so, and again, I think that there's so many great books on this. I am not even going to begin to start, but this is something that I would love to follow up with if anyone wants to email me to give some recommendations.
Okay, thank you. So one question that I also have is about St. Thomas and using St. Thomas as a kind of source. Now, I remember in high school when I did Caribbean studies. I'm from Jamaica, in case anybody was wondering. And I remember doing Caribbean studies, and I heard about the Danish West Indies existing. That's where we started. That's where we stopped. And it's sad, but this book does a kind of connection that I find very useful and very helpful in understanding the Caribbean and Caribbean laws. Now, could you speak more on this kind of historiography, of this way of doing history? Like, what do you envision for historians or people who are doing Black studies, Caribbean studies, or whatever the case may be? How do you envision using sources like this, and what do you think needs to be done for this kind of scholarship?
Yes, well, I think that the first thing that we need to do is get out of our nationalist boxes, right? And so this is the major shift that, so if you want to right? Even if you're interested in United States history, right? Like you have to go beyond the borders of the United States in order to understand. And with the Caribbean, you know, this is even more, it's the most obvious when you look at Caribbean history, that we have to look beyond borders, and think about interconnections, and think about how, you know, what's happening on one island is not sort of confined to that island. And so thinking more in terms of, right, I mean, sort of this move towards transnational histories, I think is really important. And then the other aspect that I think you alluded to is really thinking in terms of diaspora. So like African diasporic histories, connecting the regions, you know, of the Atlantic world, right, that where African diasporic peoples have, where they are. And there's a wonderful book, Black Atlantic Religion, where, you know, it's not just about following enslaved Africans from Africa to the Americas, but there's constant communication, right? And this is crucial for understanding religious practice as it evolves, right? It's not as if, you know, people are enslaved and, you know, taken to the Americas, and then that's it. The line is cut off, right? There are more people go back. And so, you know, relating this to the Danish West Indies specifically, here I see, and in the records of the Moravian Church, which have barely been looked at by anyone, right? And both because who's heard of the Danish West Indies? And then second, they're written in an archaic German script that's hard to read. But we can gain so much insight into African diasporic practices by reading these documents, and I hope that more people will use them, will pay attention to them, and that they can provide a new way to understand these histories.
Dr. Gerbner, thank you so much for this conversation on modern racial categories. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Gustafson. I enjoyed this thoroughly, and I hope to read this book again and just keep learning from it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate we're out of time. I'm sure there's a lot more we could have discussed, so I encourage those of you out there in the audience to check out the book for more, if you can. This has been a wonderful hour of constructive learning, I must say, from Katharine and Dominic, and I want to thank both of you for inviting us into your important conversation, especially, you know, its relevance for our contemporary world this past year, with a renewed consciousness around racial justice and white supremacy in the United States. I also want to thank all of you, the viewers, again, for being with us. And I invite all of you to please join me in thanking Dr. Gerbner and Dominic, and we hope you can all join us for a future event. Have a peaceful day, everyone.